I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we don't normally do this is whatever month or anything like that celebrating.
We don't really pay much attention to the outside world, is what you're saying.
We're very much grounded in Chinese literature, and we're living 1,000 years ago during the Song Dynasty, and our bodies are here, but we are not here.
That explains so much about this podcast.
Except for all the beer and Beatles references.
True, fair enough.
We normally ignore if it's like Asian American Pacific Islander month or whatever, but I just happened to be reading through a collection of poems from poets from San Francisco's Chinatown. Why not have a couple of poems by Chinese American poets written in Chinese about 100 years ago and we'll kind of shove it in to our May podcast. We had already been doing that weird poetry series. We did one episode that we had published, and so we're going to interrupt that episode, that series, and we'll get back to it, we promise. But Rob, is it okay if we just mess things up?
Well, considering that's kind of our MO, I think it's more like we're just going to stick to what we do best. So let's continue to mess things up.
This entire podcast is just messed up.
It kind of is. And people are listening to it, so I don't know. Does that make them messed up?
The poems that we're doing this week and next week, we'll do one this week, one next week, are taken from a 1911 and a 1915 collection of poetry collected in San Francisco, published by two printing presses and booksellers in Chinatown in San Francisco. The name of those works are 金强歌记, and so it's just 金强歌记 1 and 金强歌记 2, one being published in 1911, two being published in 1915. I think they had different publishers, but I'm not 100% on that. The text that I have, which I'm drawing from, and if the listener is interested, it might be a cool thing to check out. It's probably hard to find, but if you have access to a university library, it's called Songs of Gold Mountain, Cantonese Rhymes from San Francisco Chinatown by Marlon K. Hom. That's H-O-M. And Hom talks about them as being written in Cantonese. Rob, help me out. I'm not sure what that actually means, right?
Yeah, no. When you look at them on the page, it just looks like standard Mandarin. I think probably what it means is something to do with the rhyme scheme, the way they may have been sung, because the Geji would be a song collection, not necessarily poetry. Sure, something like that. So that could be what it refers to. But yeah, my first response wasn't, "Oh wow, this is weird. This must be Cantonese."
It's interesting because I've looked through the poetry a good bit more than you because I'm using it for a project, and sometimes I will find Hanzi, the Chinese characters that I have no idea what they're talking about. And when I search around on the internet, oftentimes they indicate words that are only used in Cantonese, or they're a character that's specifically used in Cantonese. So when you dig into these poems a little bit more, it is apparent that this is not standard Mandarin.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and to draw this kind of into practical experience. If any of you, dear listeners, have been to Chinatown in San Francisco, New York, Chicago, any of the big Chinatowns, and then you've gone to China, you can be forgiven for going, this doesn't seem anything like Chinatown. And that happened to me the first time I went to Chinatown in San Francisco. After having been to China, I was like, this is weird. Then I went to Hong Kong and went, oh, I see. Okay, this does actually feel a lot like Chinatown. Because so many of the people who are writing these poems that we're going to be talking about, that's where they were coming from, southern China. They weren't immigrating to the U.S. from Hunan province or something like that.
Absolutely. Most in the U.S. and in most of the West, so Australia, North and South America, most of the immigrants are Cantonese speaking. And in Southeast Asia, most of them are from Fujian, so they would speak Minanyu, which is the same language that is referred to as Taiwanese. Rob, I think you're right. We're kind of getting too much into the weeds here. Could you read the poem we're doing today?
Yeah, I'll read our poem. And just real quick to situate the listener here, we're dealing with poems written shortly after a period when, to put it mildly, relations between China and the U.S. were not great. The Chinese Exclusion Act was in 1882, and that effectively banned Chinese immigration for all intents and purposes. And without getting into all of the details of what was in it, 10 years later, the Geary Act strengthened the restrictions. And at least stop me if I'm wrong, I believe it was the Geary Act that said, basically, if you're Chinese and you want to sign a legal contract, you have to have a white witness to stand with you. Is that the one I'm thinking of?
I'm not 100% sure, but California, where most of the Chinese immigrants actually went, California further restricted that kind of stuff. So there was a variety of laws. 1882 is probably the watershed law with the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Geary Act, 10 years later, is also very important. But it's important not to think of this as like one or two laws. There were a bunch of different laws all throughout that were, white supremacists, excluding Chinese from a lot of civil rights.
And for a lot of the same reasons. The Chinese are coming and stealing our jobs, and they're overwhelming our social network and all of that stuff. Anyway, that's a lot of history, and a lot of it we're going to get into anyway with the poems. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to read the first poem. Now, Lee, none of these have names attached. Am I missing something, or is that the way that really is?
No, I think that's correct. None of these have names. It's not unusual for a poem in the Chinese tradition to be untitled. Also, keep in mind, we have no clue, as far as I know, who the authors of these poems are. They're just collected in these two collections.
So this one doesn't have a title either, but I think you'll see why in a second we chose to discuss this one. So I'll read the translation. America, I have come and landed, and am stranded here for more than a year, suffering thousands upon thousands of mistreatments. Is it in retribution for a past life that I deserve such defilement? It is outrageous, being humiliated repeatedly by them. I pray my country will become strong and even the score. Send out troops, like Japan's war against Russia. Now, of course, the historical reference there at the end, for anyone not familiar with early 20th century Chinese history, is the Russo-Japanese War, which was notably messed up for being a war fought in China, but not with the Chinese. It's like people coming to your house to have a fist fight. It was really messed up.
Which, Rob, you and I occasionally do.
Agreed, at Brandon's house, but he's not here right now, so we can't really do that. Now, this poem, it's not particularly subtle, so we don't need to break down a lot of the logic or anything like that. But it is interesting, and you'll see, if you read the whole collection, you would see how it kind of runs the gamut. There's lots of poems about wanting to get rich, getting rich, all of that. But then there's a whole section of poems about people being deeply disillusioned, hurt, insulted, humiliated, because, as often happened, they were subjected to some pretty nasty stuff when they got to America.
It sounds like this poet is referring to his time in Angel Island, which is kind of the West Coast equivalent of Ellis Island. Ellis Island is much more famous in American discourse because so many European Americans came through there in the 19th century. Angel Island really hasn't gotten the press it deserves. Rob, you and I actually did an episode on poetry carved into the walls of Angel Island. So at least the top podcast in the Chinese literature sphere is on it, even if not everybody else is. But this poet is referring to, I guess, his time imprisoned there, where they went through pretty humiliating questions and semi-legal, semi-illegal searches.
Right, and it's not a unique entry.
Really quickly, this is Lee. I did a bit of additional research after we recorded this podcast, and I just wanted to point out Angel Island was not actually used as an immigration station until about 1910. These poems were collected in 1911 and 1915, so it's unlikely, though not impossible, that this poet was imprisoned on Angel Island. Rather, he was probably imprisoned in what was just called the Wooden Barracks. That was a immigration facility made out of wood, who would have guessed? And it was located in the area of present-day San Francisco Pier 50. Now that I'm done with that little correction, back to the podcast.
There's a couple of things I think are interesting about it, though, in particular. One, there's always a downside, a dark side to immigration, and this one is an example.
It's
but
this very violent, dark thing, right?
Is almost eerie or ominous because he's praying that his country will become strong and even the score and send out troops. It's violent and dark, and I feel like this is such a perfect introduction for anyone who has a hard time understanding China's ongoing chip on the shoulder attitude to the world. China experienced enormous amounts of humiliation at the hands of European powers in the United States over the course of several decades. There is a point when you see poems and stories and things like this where you'll hear voiced some version of someday it's going to come back around. Someday we're going to get this. We're going to get ours. We're going to get ours back, you know? So when I read this poem now and then open the newspaper, I just open the newspaper. It's a news app. I'm not opening any newspapers. But it's interesting to read the news about Chinese-American relations. And when you read poems like this, you go, see, this is why it's so complicated. Because Chinese people over the course of several decades as immigrants in America were subjected to just awful, awful treatment. Some of them did become rich, that is for sure, but a whole lot of others were humiliated, deported, abused, and other things, and some of them, like this person, are writing about something that possibly China is trying to still enact now.
I don't want to deflate your bubble too much, but I just want to point out that so a lot of these restrictions on immigration that were applied to Chinese folks immigrating to America were also applied by the Qing dynasty to Americans going to China. The Qing did not, for a long time, allow European or American women into China. There was a pretty strict regime of where you could go. It was quite controlled. I don't think that excuses the American behavior, but I think that there is in these discussions in China, there's always a focus on what happened to Chinese folks, which is a perfectly good discussion of the sort of victim. But then there's never this pivot to, how are we the imperialists? The Qing was actually one of the greatest imperial powers in Chinese history and in the world. But I think what this poem for me does is it reminds us of the unfairness of that these future Americans were subjected to, and the sort of extra legal means of harassment that they had. And you see the kind of violence that this poet is trying to resort to deal with what he's really angry about.
Yeah, and something we need to throw in the mix there, because historically, of course, a lot of Chinese empires did horrible things and excluded a lot of people. What's really happening here is not just that someone is chafing under unfair restrictions or laws or anything like that. That's one part of it. The other part is that this is someone coming from a country that was, as you said, one of the great empires in history, and now is almost a doormat, an international doormat, which was the real humiliation. It wasn't just the treatment, it was the knowledge that there was nothing they could do about it. The Qing court was not going to, the Qing court famously was just obliterated by any military conflict it participated in. So there's a point where they just knew they were powerless, right? And so it's interesting, the last line doesn't say send out troops, send out Chinese troops. It's basically sending out troops like the Japanese, because the Chinese aren't strong enough. The Japanese are. And that is really the issue. And to some extent, even today, it's not the issue anymore in the sense that China really is weak. But if you're ever in China, there is still this sense of no one really knows, no one believes we're as strong as we actually are, and we have to prove it. Because when you've had an empire that big, that lasted for that long, and then in the span of about, I don't know, would you say 30 or 40 years? Between the McCartney Embassy and, between the McCartney Embassy and the First Opium War was 40 years, 50 years?
Yeah. So the McCartney Embassy was 1793. The Opium War, the first Opium War, began in 1839.
That's right, 1839. So not long. That's a pretty quick fall from grace, and then it was all downhill from there. And so this poem, for me, one of the reasons it's so interesting is that the last two lines, first is a prayer that they're going to become strong, but second, like who? Not like them, like another country in Asia that's strong.
Yeah, he could have.
So it's violent, but it's also kind of poignant too.
He could have talked about other points in Chinese history where they were going to expel the barbarians, and he didn't. He talked about the Japanese and them smacking down the Russians.
So Lee, does that just sound like a pretty good place to wrap it up?
I think so. This is a fascinating poem. We'll put it up on the website, both the English translation and the Chinese, we'll say. I don't know if it qualifies as Cantonese or Wen or what. We'll put up the original on the website. Check it out. Anything else?
That's all I've got.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.